Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into something uh, really quite thought-provoking, a potential shift in the American psyche, one that maybe few saw coming. We're digging into this excerpt. It's titled, "Beware the Day America Falls Back in Love with Itself." And it argues there's this profound cultural transformation happening, a move away from what it labels learned self-disgust, which, sounds pretty intense.
It really is a fascinating perspective. It points to maybe a subtle but quite powerful rebellion against narratives that have felt dominant for decades now. So our mission today really is to unpack this central idea. We need to examine the claims the article makes, its origins, its effects, and just explore what it might mean if a culture starts redefining its relationship with itself.
Okay, let's start there then. This core idea the text introduces. A long, slow campaign to make Americans recoil at their own reflection. That's strong language. What does the source mean by this, and what parts of American identity does it think have been, well, targeted?
Well, the argument presented is that it was pretty comprehensive, almost every aspect. Politics, foreign policy, even their flag, their culture, their history, their bodies, down to their instincts. And what's striking is the claim that, okay, maybe some of this began with good intentions, things like, reckonings overdue or addressing history's whitewashed, justice deferred.
Right, important stuff.
Absolutely. But the argument is that it then metastasized, that's the word used, into something else, this learned self-disgust. It even calls it a cultural autoimmune disorder.
Wow, a cultural autoimmune disorder. That is a vivid image.
It really is.
It suggests these efforts, however they started, kind of ended up creating this deep internal conflict. But then the article shifts and makes this pretty bold claim. The fever is breaking. It says, against predictions, people are falling back in love with themselves. How does it describe this? It says it's not the performative red hat kind of way or, rah-rah nationalism.
No, it uses a much more personal analogy. It's like a battered person looks in the mirror one morning and decides to stop apologizing for existing.
Okay.
So what that points to isn't some loud public display, but more of a quiet, deeply personal reacceptance. The text suggests you see it in these subtle, everyday kinds of moments, things like small-town 4th of July parades that don't feel ironic anymore, or the unashamed pleasure of a brisket smoked for 12 hours in a backyard pit, someone saying grace at a diner without lowering their voice, or maybe an old church hymnal being dusted off, not out of duty, but longing. The argument is that this growing comfort, this self-acceptance, is something that, quote, the architects of shame can feel slipping.
That's quite a contrast. It sounds less like, I don't know, an organized movement and more like an organic rediscovery of just being okay with yourself or your culture. So if the culture was sort of conditioned into this self-disgust, the big question is why, right? And the article pivots here to what it calls the narrative, a system it claims was designed really to manage America's transformation. So what does it mean by weaponized guilt in this context?
Yeah, weaponized guilt is presented as the key tool. The playbook, as the excerpt describes it, involved making people feel ashamed. Ashamed of their ancestors, their flag, their faith, their masculinity, their femininity, their whiteness, their weight, their burgers, their trucks. You get the idea.
Yeah.
Their carbon footprint, their consumption, basically, of their everything. And into this shame vacuum, the text says, a savior class was introduced.
A savior class.
This includes entities like consultants, DEI officers, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that is, and organizations pushing what the article calls imported morality, international standards, global credentials, even compliant corporations or NGOs.
That's quite a charge against those groups.
The source is making a very provocative argument there about weaponized guilt and the savior class.
Does it give specific examples of this playbook, or is it more of a conceptual analysis, like how it thinks these shifts happened?
It's presented much more as a conceptual analysis, yeah. It's outlining the perceived mechanics of this narrative. The underlying message seems to be that transformation was framed as only possible when Americans felt bad enough about themselves to basically hand over power, or at least influence, to this new class. It's positioned as a strategy, really.
Okay, I see. And what's really interesting here is the article's next point. That even a tool as powerful as shame, well, it has limits. It says shame has diminishing returns. How does it suggest this weaponized guilt eventually just wears out? What do people supposedly realize?
Well, the article is pretty blunt. It says shame wears out, or wears thin, or gets laughed at. And the breaking point, it argues, seems to be when people being told to hate themselves start comparing notes. And they realize, wait, this isn't making us better. It's making us weaker, poorer, sadder, lonelier, fatter, broker, sicker, just worse off.
Right.
And there's also this potent point about perceived hypocrisy. The text states, quite plainly, and the elites, they're not ashamed at all.
Yeah. That disconnect the article implies is where the narrative really starts to fracture.
That idea of shame just running out of steam or people seeing through it, that makes a certain kind of sense. But what could actually start people breaking free on a personal level? The article points to something, frankly, quite unexpected to illustrate this. It says, Ozempic didn't start the fire, but it helped. How on earth does it connect a weight loss drug to a broader cultural shift?
Yeah, it's a surprising connection, isn't it? But it raises this question about how our personal self-perception can link to these wider societal shifts. The article argues pretty directly that self-love doesn't start in the mind, it starts in the mirror.
And for what it calls a certain demographic of deeply demoralized Americans, Ozempic is presented as like a permission slip, a flicker of hope, a reminder that, you don't have to give up, that you're not maybe stuck in that shame forever.
So like a catalyst for personal change.
Exactly. The claim is that this sparked a belief in change, in progress, but critically, not as a collectivist guilt trip, but as a personal arc, a sense of a body reclaimed, a self-reseated indignity. And the argument is that this personal feeling, this shift, then snowballed into something much bigger, culturally speaking.
So the article argues this very personal experience, this reclamation, kind of snowballed. It's quite a connection to make, linking individual physical change to, well, national self-acceptance. So what does all this mean then for a country if it stops waiting for permission, stops waiting for outside approval to just love itself? The article asks, what happens when the slurs and shames and media landmines no longer detonate? What kind of freedom is it imagining?
Well, what's really powerful here is this concept of love without permission. That's the phrase it uses. The article asks us to imagine what happens when someone says, I love this country, and doesn't feel like they need, 10 qualifiers attached.
Right.
And it applies this idea across different groups. It talks about straight people stop apologizing, white people stop groveling, trans people stop being told that their identity is their politics, and black people stop being used as avatars for someone else's agenda.
So a kind of universal reclaiming of identity, separate from politics.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it paints this picture of a future where gay love, black love, trans love, brown love, and yes, white love are all just love again. And the description is key. Not branded, not performative, not weaponized, just human.
Just human. That's a powerful endpoint. But the article does suggest this isn't some kind of perfect utopia, right? It calls it something livable, survivable, home. But then it adds, for the ones who made a fortune selling self-loathing as virtue, this shift is actually terrifying. Why would this self-love be seen as a threat, according to the source?
Well, if we connect this back to the bigger picture the article paints, the argument is that love, real love, is self-sustaining. A self-loving America, it suggests, doesn't need your scripts, your guilt catalogs, your grievance metrics, your soft power proxy wars over language and flags and toilets, all that external stuff.
So it implies a kind of independence.
Exactly. A self-sufficient, independent populist that will just, plant its garden. It'll raise its kids. It'll fix its car. It'll grill a steak. It'll sing old songs. It'll love what it loves without permission. And here's the kicker, the most potent implication laid out in the article. And it will be terrifyingly hard to control.
Wow. That's a striking conclusion, that genuine self-acceptance, self-love becomes a threat to those who perhaps benefited from promoting self-loathing. It really reframes the power dynamic.
It absolutely does. It implies this kind of organic, inherent resilience that doesn't rely on external validation or external direction.
Yeah.
And that's a very, very different vision of society than what the article claims has been the dominant narrative for a while.
Indeed. Well, this deep dive into beware the day America falls back in love with itself has certainly given us a lot to chew on, from the alleged origins of this national self-disgust to these subtle signs of a maybe burgeoning self-love, the really profound implications of such a shift.
It really challenges us, I think, to consider what drives cultural narratives, and crucially, what happens when those narratives start to lose their grip for whatever reason.
Yeah. This shift from shame to self-acceptance. If the arguments in the article hold any water, it sounds like a truly profound reorientation, almost like rediscovering a nation's soul. It really makes you wonder. If a nation, or any group really, genuinely loves itself without needing outside permission, what new kinds of collective action or maybe just individual freedom might emerge that we haven't even really considered yet?